How's it going, everyone? I want to welcome everyone to our panel for today called Combating Anti-Blackness in Filipino Hip-Hop Culture. My name is Rod Labrador. I'm a professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. I haven't been in the room with these folks in a while, so I'm really excited to have this conversation with everyone. In part, this conversation is in response to what's been going on recently, but the questions that we'll be talking about, or the questions that we'll be asking and the conversation we'll be having, has been something that's been going on for a while. And so basically we have several questions that we want to ask. First is, how do we understand Blackness in our communities, and what are the ways that we perpetuate anti-Blackness in our communities? Also, we want to ask, what is the relationship, what is our relationship to Blackness, and how does this inform our art, our music, our politics, our communities? And then lastly, how do we build Filipino and Black solidarities? And that's to say, how do we build bridges? You know, how are we able to kind of connect with folks, build bridges, not walls? But before we get to all those questions, I wanted to bring up the panelists and have them introduce themselves. For each of the panelists, please tell us about the moment, the decisive moment when you knew you wanted to pursue hip hop, that you wanted to go down this path, and how have you navigated your participation within hip hop as a Filipinx American? And so maybe let's start with Kandi to kind of introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Rod. Good to see you. An honor to be here. That's such a long story to wrap up in like 5-minute time frame about my journey in hip hop, because I'm still experiencing it every day. But I was born and raised from my hometown, the unceded occupied territory of Mansi Lenape, now known as Queens, New York City. So it's really in a town, in a city like New York City, it's difficult to not be immersed into hip hop. It's all around you. New York City itself is a foundation of hip hop culture. It's everything, a culture, an experience, a feeling in your body, in your soul. So much that it's always been global in so many ways. Even if you didn't practice the elements of hip hop, you grew up around it. I grew up around it. So even if I didn't particularly do or live hip hop, you still knew it. So for many, including myself, it was about joy, struggle, hope. I mean that in the essence of not just knowing artists or loving artists like Queen Latifah or Tribe Called Quest or Public Enemy, but listening to Miles Davis, James Brown, Nina Simone, Al Green, and the Last Poets. So for me, it's what it meant to grow up in hip hop. It's to know every part of its fabric and legacy, especially its lineage and rooted in Black culture, but also stemming from the Black liberation tradition for me, because it was always about survival and about getting free. Having been brought up in Black and Brown communities and witnessing their struggles taught me what it meant to be in solidarity. Having gone through a home I always ran away from because of violence, hip hop showed me that I was not alone, as hip hop and those in hip hop took me in. So while hip hop has also been about joy for me, it's also been about the pain, the conflict, the contradictions, and all the tensions. So this too was also hip hop. So Joan Morgan, who a good friend of mine who coined the term hip hop feminism, taught me this about the gray areas. And I talked about this last week. Many of my mentors who were pioneers of hip hop culture have also taught me several things. One is that we must always give respect to our ancestors, the pioneers, the legends, which is why knowing hip hop history is crucial. So many of our legends have been forgotten, erased, and not included. And this is not just an erasure of hip hop culture, essentially erasing Black people and Black culture. But if we really knew hip hop history and culture, you would know that you should always give back to the community. I never knew not one hip hop pioneer who never gave and served their communities in a cross. They always gave. And it's because they taught me 3 important words. And these are the words they taught me. Listen up. Organize, organize, organize. I think that's why I do what I do. It's my pathway to hip hop. And it continued on because I found home in hip hop, and we were always looking out for one another, and we always organized together. It took care of you. And especially when I was looking for a sense of belonging and being. And from the jump, it taught me about my own history, having gone through high school in New York City. That was actually the first school in New York City that had metal detectors. So I experienced policing and police culture. And when hip hop found me, it taught me about resistance, self-determination, and brought me conviction and purpose to serve the people. But there's something here about survival, which I'll talk more about later, in my understanding of my own positionality within, through, and beyond hip hop, that as an Asian American, as a Filipinx, I understand, while it is true that hip hop saved my life, that means differently for everyone in terms of race, power, privilege, and access. Which brings me to recall how my friend Bettina Love talks about in her own book, We Want to Do More Than Survive. From the beginning, she already names that mattering means, what mattering means to Black lives. And where she says, we who are dark, which is echoed and lifted from W.E.B. Du Bois' book, W.E.B. Du Bois, we who are dark can see America in a way that white Americans cannot. So I state that here as a Filipinx, who may go through my own forms of oppression, I could never understand or have experienced or will ever experience oppression of Black people. So with that being said, as a Filipinx, how I participate in hip hop culture means several things. It means living a life with principled struggle. It means that although I understand hip hop, practice it, contribute to it, and been mentored by pioneers and oftentimes called a legend of hip hop, I'm always gentle of movement and language and experiences that are not my own, as co-optation and theft of movements and language of Black people, lives and experiences and cultures are real. So it means to me that I'm nothing more than just a guest in hip hop culture. So solidarity is a foundation for me and how I contribute and participate in hip hop culture. It taught me about solidarity, and it's not just about the freedom to express, but rather the right and the fight to get free. So I'm going to be this guest. If I'm going to be this guest, if any of us are going to be this guest in hip hop, then it cannot just be about combating anti-Black racism, because that is not enough. Rather, we must understand the principles of the Black radical tradition and must be about pro-Black liberation. And that's how I come into this work, through hip hop culture.
Hey, thanks, Kandi. Bambu. How about for you? What was it for you in terms of how do you enter hip hop, and what does it mean for you as a Filipinx artist?
Hello, everybody. Hello, Kandi, Rod, everybody out there in the undiscovered X world. Well, I mean, hip hop was always around me as a youth. You know, I grew up in the late 80s, early 90s. So hip hop was just kind of making its way and its footprint in LA, where I'm originally from. And I just gravitated towards it. It was kind of the outcast counterculture thing to do. So I really gravitated to that just because of who I was. And then I realized I could actually do it, and I was pretty nice at it. And then while, you know, exploring this, a lot of things were happening in my life, both politically, you know, just things that were happening with me, and hip hop really spoke to me. And so, you know, and it also allowed, as a medium, as an art form, allowed me to be unapologetic in the way I wanted to express myself. So, you know, for that, as a Black art form, has been very, very, very therapeutic, has been instrumental in my growth in life. So, you know, the short answer is that I discovered it kind of when everybody else in my age group was discovering it, and I realized I was actually kind of nice at it. So turned it into a career.
Okay. And then we bring up Arnel. Maybe you can talk about your own path into all of this, since I think we're getting folks from the different elements.
Well, first of all, hello, everyone. My name is Arnel. I am tuning in from Long Beach on occupied lands of Tongva and Kiev. It's an honor to be here with you, Professor Rob and Kandi and Bambu, of course. So for me, I grew up in Carson, Harbor City area. And so my neighborhoods, the parks, the schoolyards, the community centers was filled with all four elements of hip hop. And I was always a fan of b-boying, b-girling, popping, locking. Those were like really prevalent in my neighborhoods at the family parties. And so I've always, I echo what Kandi said. I've always felt like a guest in the house of hip hop, but a very welcomed guest. And so because of that welcoming and that embracing that I felt in my community, I've been connected to community pretty much my entire life, from being a Boy Scout to Key Club to talent shows, to creating Kaba Modern at UC Irvine, and to hearing the voices of the dancers in the community wanting to create events and gatherings, to now being much more passionate about education and advocacy. I'm a doctor of occupational therapy as well. And so I have kind of been leaning into convergence of how we can take the principles of hip hop and other amazing art forms as well, and other cultures, and put it together with advocacy and accessibility and inclusion. So I created a dance therapy program for kids with special needs, and hip hop is so aligned with that because of all of the stories and spirit of our Black brothers and sisters who were really truly creating something by the community for the community, from the Boogie Down Bronx all the way down to here in LA. So carrying that spirit forward in the advocacy and inclusion of all kids.
Great. Thank you all for your intros, and maybe let's bring everybody back so we can have our conversation. Hearing about your path into hip hop, I was kind of wondering, did you have any kind of pushback from your families or from your community? Because one of the things I often hear from artists, whether from, who are starting off in the 90s to the 2000s to now, is that one of the things that their parents or their families tell them is, why are you doing this? Why are you dancing like that? Are you trying to be Black? Why are you rapping? Are you trying to be Black? Right? Did you get any of that kind of response from your parents or your family members?
I can. Mine's short. Not in the way that I think I've heard my peers speak about it. I was in the street, so they were more concerned about that. They didn't really care about what I was listening to. They were more concerned about what I was actually doing in the street. So no, I don't think my parents really knew that I was even that involved in it until they went to the first festival of Filipino arts and culture that they saw me perform at. And they're like, oh, like, you really do this. Like, this is something you really do. So, again, my parents weren't tripping off the music or the culture I had adapted to while I was here. They were more concerned about the other cultures I had been attached to while I was here, which was like street culture.
Right. What about Kandi or Arnel? Because this relates to a question I want to ask after.
Kandi, go first.
Yeah.
Good question. I think because my family actually were really supportive. And now that I'm thinking about it, like, I want to unpack that why, right? So like for me, my like Bam, I got caught up in a lot of things, and I think they saw that this was something that, where I had a passion in and was involved in, and they had a lot of love for things. And my dad was a vinyl collector, and he loved music so much. So he loved all kinds of music. He was the one that introduced me to all music, including from, John Coltrane to talking about days from Motown days, to the Beatles, to whoever. He was a big music lover. But that does not mean that they didn't have any anti-Blackness or anti-Black racism. It didn't mean that when I would participate or do a dance or hip hop, they wouldn't say things like, you're acting Black, because they did, even though they loved the idea of me doing hip hop. Like, my mom can name certain terms of hip hop, and she's like, and then she'll start bragging because she got really proud of me, because it was also bringing me a certain proximity of success in a different way that I wouldn't typically do, like for most Filipinx. Even, as a matter of fact, when I said I was going to be a nurse, she's like, what? You don't want to be a nurse? She knew before I did that I didn't want to be a nurse. But, it didn't mean that she didn't come, or my family members didn't come with a form of anti-Black racism, in short, because they still, even with my successes in it, and they loved it, which is a lot to unpack, really, because that speaks to the overall arc of, like, all of us who participate in hip hop, the successes that come with it, but also what they leave out of it. You could be successful, you could love hip hop, but you don't love Black folks, which is often said. And that's literally what happens with family members and loved ones in my life who love what I do, but don't don't stand for justice for Black folks, you know?
Wow. What about you, Arnel?
It's interesting because my parents were really supportive of me, doing different art forms, whether it was hip hop, locking, or house, as long as I continued with my cultural dancing, because I grew up learning all the different cultural dancing, and as I was proud of both and I was doing both, and so I grew up doing both. But I have to say, like, my extended family, on the other hand, I experienced a lot of colorism. So a lot of like, oh, you shouldn't dance outside so often, you're turning so dark. And I'm like, wow, I love my darkness, you know what I mean? And they say like, oh, you're turning dark like, ego or whatever. And for me, my neighborhood was very mixed, in fact, the minority was probably white, to be honest. It was mainly Black and brown in my neighborhood. So I feel like my parents, there wasn't as much anti-Blackness with my parents, but right beyond my parents, brothers and sisters, a lot of those negative isms, being thrown our way, and especially because my brother and I grew up in Carson. So there was even elitism between like where we live and Cerritos. So the Cerritos cousin, they had a lot to say about where we are, what we're doing. And so that was a lot of the anti-Blackness that I kind of grew up with. Yeah,
because I guess that's part of the next question I wanted to ask, because it seems like if we're talking about the Filipinx, anti-Black racism amongst Filipinx in our culture, one of the things I wanted to kind of address is like, how are we understanding Blackness in our own families, in our own communities, right? How does our own kind of relationship to Blackness, how are our own experiences and understandings of Blackness, how is that shaping your art, right? How is that shaping your politics and our broader culture? And so I think, Arnel, you brought up the, stay away from the sun, don't get too dark.
Yeah.
Did you all get these messages, and what is the message? I think Kandi is saying, let's unpack this a little bit. What does that mean then? And this is something that I think we often talk about in our community in terms of stay out of the sun, don't be too dark. But what does that actually mean, right? What are we running from? What is this darkness?
I feel like, and that's why like it's interesting. Like I always feel like in this moment when we're thinking about building towards allyship with the Black Lives Matter movement, we have to do a lot of inner work of understanding our own cultures as well, and where those colorism even sits within our culture, because my mom's side looked down upon my dad's side because my dad's from the province and my mom is from the city, and so even like that age-old thing about even colorism in the Philippines, that traveled with them when they immigrated here, and even though as a first generation Filipino American here, it's different for me. My dad grew up with that, and my dad grew up that with his entire life, and so I definitely echo what Kandi said earlier. We as allies will never know the Black experience. You know what I mean? That is their experiences to voice, and it's important. It's that those are the voices we need to amplify for us to learn from. But we also need to examine our intersectionality of where we connect, so that in that intersectionality we can truly build allyship and kinship and solidarity with them. But yeah, it's really. I'm still learning, I'm still a canvas for understanding, the Black experience, and just continuing to hold space for my friends who share with me, and also committing to my own journey of learning myself, because it's ultimately our responsibility, as Filipino Americans and allies who want to be allies, to commit to the work of educating ourselves, and like Kandi said, unpacking it within ourselves, then unpacking it in conversations with those we love and who we live with, and then into our communities, and then there building kinship and allyship in our actions and our words of how we treat other people, and we dismantle systemic racism and things that are bringing our brothers and sisters down. So.
And I also think that when we talk about anti-Blackness within the Filipino community, we're talking about a byproduct, and you were talking about colorism and things like that. Filipino people, we're not born this way. We're not born inherently racist, or this is something taught. Eurocentric beauty is something that's programmed into us. So when I'm sitting across from someone else who might have all these things to say that I don't agree with, as a basis of conversation, I think Arnel brought it up, the word intersectionality, is finding that. And that, you know what, I might be sitting across from a Manang who is pro-Trump and is, just saying all the wrong things, but I know that that's something that was conditioned in her. So I approach those conversations, and the goal, I think, of this entire workshop here, so that we can approach these things better, these conversations better, with the hopes of creating some impact towards change in our community. And so what I definitely want to say here is that, when speaking to our own kababayan about these things and about these disagreements, especially when it comes to recognizing what anti-Blackness is, I think we need to first understand that this is all conditioning. That is not the enemy sitting across from you. That is another Filipino person who just unfortunately has bought into this American dream and has bought into this, again, that this Eurocentric umbrella of beauty, of just the way we live our Western lives. So with that being said, I think again, when we're talking about Filipino people, we weren't born this way. I think we should always remember that this is something that is a byproduct of thousands and thousands of years of programming Filipino people to believe these things. And so it's not necessarily our fault, but it is our job to fix that shit. I mean, that stuff. My bad.
I think, yes, agree with everything. I think in its essence, we think about Filipinx people. You could look at certain models if you want to break it down in a sociological standard, models of like the racial formation theory or racial hierarchy, understanding where we are in our positionality. But I look maybe something more of Claire Kim's work around racial triangulation. I might be going over people's heads, but I think when in understanding that kind of work, but really in its very basic foundational essence is, our people have been colonized. So you look at white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and its foundation of those three pillars, and understanding what it took to create white supremacy and anti-Blackness. Anti-Black racism is the fulcrum, which Scott Nakagawa breaks down really lovely about a decade ago on how it's a fulcrum to white supremacy. So in understanding that model and modality and understanding imperialism and when colonialism and then went to the Philippines and et cetera, in order to colonize people, they had to create this construct of Blackness in order to then get this idea that we have to assimilate, and within the colorism and all of those things unpacked. So for us understanding this, it talks about, this is how certain things come about the model minority myth, this race to attain whiteness, and this myths that have been created. So it serves mostly to reinforce white power and privilege. And so we've got to understand where do we sit in that racial hierarchy, but also our own experiences of oppression that we experience, and that how that differs differently within that racial triangulation that I kind of spewed on everybody here. But the idea is to argue that Asian Americans have achieved the American dream of meritocracy again, which is that, well, if Asians can achieve this dream, why can't Black people do it? And that it does that, it reinforces that idea of bootstrap mentality. And then it fails to recognize all of our differences as Asians, but us specifically as Filipinx people, which Kevin Nadal actually breaks down a lot, E.J.R. David in their work, well, Kevin specifically on the Philippine American identity development model, right? Like what makes us different amongst all other Asians. And it excludes other Asians too, talking about Southeast Asians, Lao, Thai, all of that thing. So for me, assimilation in itself, in order to get that proximity to whiteness, and that's what we're running away from. We're running away from because our families have been through colonialism. They have been through war. They don't want to experience it again. It's trauma. that trauma of oppression that people are experiencing, not to make excuses for those behavior. But once you become knowledgeable about those things, you can then work towards, being pro-Black liberation. You see you're not just in a transactional way, but this is about humanization. We have been dehumanized. So then we've learned to dehumanize other people. And so with that, if we are more knowledgeable and aware of those things, we can do more work to hone in into what does it mean to be pro-Black? What does it mean to live on the work and the legacy and honor the Black radical tradition and be intersectional and have a Black feminist lens, and that's what it means to really be aware.
Right. So I think you've all brought up these ideas of how these ideas that we have about Blackness, the ideas that we have about whiteness is historical, right? That it's political, that it's cultural, that it's learned, as Bambu is saying, that we are not essentially anti-Black, right? That we're not fundamentally this, but these are learned kinds of things. But I also wanted to ask you, so how do you see these kinds of ideas around Blackness or this anti-Blackness? How do you see that playing out in the hip-hop, in Filipinx participation in hip-hop, right? I think there's comments or questions about, I see this often, particularly with I've seen this throughout the use of the N-word, right? And the kind of ways that, or what kinds of consequences do those have in terms of our own ideas of who we are, but also in terms of how we're participating in this culture, and what does that mean in terms of building community across different racial and ethnic lines.
I think what I find when working with youth, especially youth in regards to emceeing, the first failure is in recognizing that hip hop is a Black art form. Not just recognizing it, but leading with that, and always remembering that this is Black art, and that it's not something that we can easily put a facelift over and call it Filipino hip hop, or Asian hip hop. Like that immediately, just in its nature, is already saying, we're doing it differently than the way it was intended, which is already very anti-Black from its inception. Anywhere you go from there is never going to lead you to a place of Black solidarity, and especially within Black liberation. So I think that's the first thing. I'll let everybody else speak to the rest of it, but I think the first thing is in recognizing that hip hop is a Black art form. It's not Filipino hip hop because you do it. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, bound to speak on that, because it's such a problem. It just totally erases a whole history of people and their culture. And there's a saying in a lot of the pioneers of hip hop, and now people today will say hip hop's universal, and I love that. That's true, but and I agree with that. But at the same time, in order to truly become universal, we got to speak truth of that universality in the context of this racial triangulation. That we can't get to a universal hip hop if we do not make visible the injustices, if we do not make visible these power dynamics and the ways our own different powers and privileges and our own forms of oppression, and how it informs how one is positioned and how it shifts and changes. So in order to get to a real hip hop universal, then we can't be co-opting things. We can't change terms. I know the dance community is wrestling with the word urban right now and trying to change and find new terms. And we can't be co-opting and taking these names and changing and shifting in order to assimilate. I mean, Amy Tan even talked about assimilation and how the myth of America is a melting pot, or what happens in assimilations, we end up deliberately choosing the American things rather than how are we honoring difference? How are we honoring the truth and naming and making things visible and speaking truth to power?
Absolutely. I think this is a really big problem in the dance world. Absolutely. Because I've been always a big believer that know the people, then you know the dance. You know what I mean? And then if you're just doing random movements without honoring the people or the experiences or their culture that created these art forms, then you're just doing movements. You're not really doing the dance, because the dance was born from social movements, from a people, from a connection to a particular type of music. And so for the last like decade and a half, I've been really advocating in the dance community for people to really know their art forms. You know, like Bambu said, you know, hip hop and b-boy and b-girling was a Black created dance art form. You know, and of course our Puerto Rican brothers and sisters were amazing contributors to the culture as well. But this was created from Blacks' experiences and Black stories and Black music. And so when we think about all the art forms, even Vogue was created by our trans sisters, these mothers of these houses, right? And so I'm challenging a lot of instructors right now, dance educators, studio owners, take the 1 minute it takes to just mention the people who created it, to mention the culture. And it takes 1 minute. In 1 minute, you could say a lot. And if you do that, you're honoring the people it came from, because it's not enough to only know history, like dates, locations. It's a lot about the heritage and the spirit of the people who created these art forms. So knowing the difference between Don Campbell creating locking and the OGs of creating breaking, it's different people, different location, different culture, different heritage, different spirit, different time. So anyone who is a hip hop dancer or a locker or a boogaloo dancer, I think this moment's calling us to appreciate the people and the culture and the experiences that gave voice and spirit to make it an art form and make it a dance. Otherwise, in my opinion, I see it's movement. It's not dance. And
there's something I also want to add to this, Rod, because it's also, yes, naming all those things, but also recognize when we're taking up hella space. You know, I can't, for years, I mean, there's a reason why my crew Anomalies started in the 90s, in the mid 90s, because we knew, back then we were women in hip hop, and then as we grew and evolved and learned, we became a gender justice collective. But in the 90s, you know, we knew like we need to make a name in space, because spaces were men dominated all the time, and we had to claim our spaces because we had to fight for our own. And why is that? So for me, it's more like on my own website, and I don't gig like I used to. Actually, I do more speaking gigs than I gig half the time because I'm retired. I always say I'm retired. But like I literally put there, unless you recommend other folks on a panel or a speaking gig or a gig that I'm doing, you need to have other folks on that lineup. Like one time someone asked me to speak on intersectionality, and while I can lovely do that, do you have any Black feminists on that panel, especially this is their work. So like literally we have to recognize when we need to decenter ourselves and really work in this knowledge and this space. How are we being actual co-conspirators in the movement as well? Not just people naming and making visible things. What are we doing in action, right? While that's some of it, I think some of it is for us to move back.
Absolutely. Oh, that's like such a hot topic. And like when we think about our like these dance competitions, you know, is there enough Black representation if it's like a pop dance? You know what I mean? Or even our workshops, when people host workshops, is there enough representation and diversity and inclusion there? You know, I think in the dance world there's a lot of work to be done to diversify and include, especially when you're talking about art forms created by a particular group, making sure that those voices are there to teach the actual art form, you know, and decentering ourselves. Even though we may be hosting it, as hosts, we have a calling to make space and to uplift and to amplify.
How would you be able to kind of reconcile, create space, let's do these things that, these actionable things that we can do in our respective spaces? How do you reconcile, yes, let's create space, but let's also kind of focus on what we need to do as Filipinx, right? What do we need to do as our own people? What are the things that we need to be saying to our other artists in our community? Because to me, it seems like there's also kind of a generational gap, right? And maybe that's something, and maybe it's because the four of us, I know I'm older than all of you, but have a difference between like what was happening in, say, like the hip hop I grew up with in the 80s and like what's going on when Candy's has her crew in the 90s, right? That the political economic time is a little bit different, but what is it that what we can do within our communities to talk about how we can address these kinds of issues, and can we create these spaces where we can flourish as being Filipinx, but also where we can provide these spaces to build solidarities with other groups. Anybody want?
That's definitely not an easy question there. I mean, yes, we do want to create these spaces. And again, I think the best thing moving forward the best advice I can give moving forward for folks in dealing with these conversations is again, I think Kandi just came from a cancel culture workshop. And I think that's one of them things where, we have to understand who we're sitting across from when we have these conversations. And that space could be in your house, at your dinner table. We got, Thanksgiving is coming up soon. So a lot of folks are going to be getting together. I mean, these are opportunities to practice those things. But it's not going to get any easier. This panel is definitely not going to resolve any of that, but I think we can at least share ideas and put some actions into place moving forward. And again, on a micro scale, just educating folks, raising the awareness, one-to-ones, and you get the opportunity to, on a platform, to speak about these things, always leading it back to Black liberation, because our liberation is directly tied to Black liberation. Hip hop is an art form or a medium of expression, an unapologetic form of expression has benefited our community's youth. And we've been able to use this to strengthen our own cultural expression. So to help us decolonize ourselves, my point being is that hip hop was to our own cultural art here in the American landscape. Again, Black liberation is tied to our own liberation. So we must support Black liberation for the obvious reason that Black oppression must end. And selfishly, that Black liberation, again, is directly tied to our own liberation and decolonization. So moving forward, that's what we have to do. And I have a great example. I'm going to try not to name names, but there's a DJ out there who, was out tweeting some really problematic stuff. You know what I'm saying? And like, there was an opportunity for me I could either go on Twitter and meet him there on that platform. But I decided I'm going to call him. I'm going to reach out to him. I have a conversation with him. And I did. And it didn't go anywhere. And that's something I had to learn how to deal with and swallow. And I needed to learn how to process that, because I fought so hard trying to get this person to understand that there are people on the front line. And we're protesting every night. We're out on the street. Like, we're masked up. We're making moves. And here's somebody whose voice is very important in our community, bigging up Candace Owens. And if y'all don't know who Candace Owens is, she's somebody who's, repeatedly attempted to debunk stories of Black oppression, doesn't believe police, she doesn't believe that police abuse Black people. She's Black, but he's bigging her up. He's putting all these ridiculous conspiracy theories up, and I really wanted to challenge that. So when I say these things with a little bit of experience that I've had to actually go in there and talk to. This person is I consider him one of my elders. I consider him, somebody who paved the way for someone like me. I'm sure Kandi will say the same thing, and it hurt. I'm watching Ice Cube go through it too. I know Ice Cube can't defend himself, but I don't think Ice Cube logged on to Undiscovered. But I'm saying, like, it's happening. He's my hero, growing up. And so to watch him do these, if you guys aren't, school yourself up on what Ice Cube is doing on Twitter right now, but it hurts. And I'm proud, I'm a part of this panel, but really I wish I could just listen, because I'm having a difficult time with it, as I'm getting older, and a lot of young folks are coming up and asking me to listen to their music, and it gets difficult for me, because I start to hear things and I see where I failed and my peers have failed, and that raising this next generation of young MCs and young DJs. And, now I'm spend so much time trying to trying to dismantle that. Anyway, I'm rambling on, but yeah, that's
No, but I think
what
it's, maybe for Arnel and Kandi, you can talk a little bit about this, because what it seems like what Bam is talking about is really, you know, what are the ways that we show up for folks, right? How do we show up in our own communities, right, to kind of educate folks, but also how do we show up for Black communities, right? And maybe if the two of you can kind of address that, maybe that can extend the conversation a little bit.
Well, I know in the dance community, there's been like so many panels. But I think I agree with what Bambu says. Like, it starts with conversation and sharing what we're learning with each other, and also being okay ourselves with being wrong ourselves, and being lifelong learners ourselves, and being okay with learning from what other people have to share. And so I think those conversations, this is a moment of conversations in our homes, with the people we know. And then once we feel like we're ready, moving into the community and creating those. So there have already been so many. I feel like Bambu and Kandi have been on a lot already. I know I've been on a lot all summer long. But that's part of the work and the commitment that we have to make, because we hold privilege in being able to even rest. We're not living the Black experience, you know what I mean? So we have to continue to really work towards allyship by continuing that commitment to learning, sharing what we learn, and holding ourselves responsible for that education. And I think for me, when I think about different generations, because my conversations differ, you know, there are the millennials, there's the Z Gen, you know what I mean? They're all very different. I grew up 70s, 80s, and 90s. I'm actually close to your age, Rod. So we have, even just intergeneration, we have a lot to share, and a lot of different biases that we have to undo that are tied to our generational experience. But I 100% agree with Bambu that it starts with the conversation, the efforts of conversations, meaningful, and then trying to end those conversations with actionable ideas or actionable solutions, whether that's more pointing people in the right directions of things that were helpful for you to learn and educate yourself, or inviting someone to go with you to an event or go into a Zoom that you think is going to be helpful for your greater understanding. Or if you're an organizer, like what Kandi said, organizing, if that is your gift and you are great at that, then continuing to do that organizing work. So yeah, that's just me.
Oh, I was thinking of so many things in my head as you both were talking, because there's so much to do. You know, as an organizer like myself in 25 years, it didn't come overnight. I learned along the way. And hip hop, I would really proud to say that hip hop brought me to understand abolition work. You know, it really brought me into that work, and knowing the folks who've been doing abolition work early on, many years ago, in a time when in hip hop right now, where it wasn't as trending as it is today. You know, although abolition is a long movement within Black radical tradition movements and abolishing, you know, oftentimes what's lifted are white abolitionists, a lot of times, without naming Black abolitionists who taught me everything I know. And I say this because it was actually Dr. Dylan Rodriguez that spoke about how abolition is a moral, ethical obligation. And if that's the case, then we must understand that if it's an ethical obligation, then we have an obligation to work in ways. So I'm really glad Bambu talked about not knowing, and you, Arnel, not knowing, because we can't act out carceral all this. You know, as an abolitionist, I must, even though I'll get petty, because that's true, I will. And I'll, you know, but how do I act in a transformative capacity, with a transformative justice practice, where I believe in the idea and the hope in people? Like my mom, I didn't talk to her for 2 years when she voted for Trump. Literally, I did not. I literally texted her and I said, Mom, you have killed everyone I know and love. You know what I'm saying? So like, and then with a transformative lens, I said, you know what, this is my work as an organizer. An organizer is someone that believes and moves more people into the movement. That's what organizing is. You got to organize people in. And if you're not organizing people in, then you're not an organizer. And so for me, I got to organize my mom. I got to organize my family. I got to have these tough, difficult conversations and let them know I didn't know any better either. We've been conditioned, we've been colonized. So that means I must talk to our peoples. And those are difficult. And there's times I'll walk away, like I didn't talk to my mom for 2 years, you know? And you bet every day this last few months, I've been texting my mom every day talking about, I hope you make a better decision this year. You know, literally, that's what I'm doing. And that's where we need to be at. And it's more than that, okay? Because we know it's also, right. It's also more than that. We've got to not replicate these structures of things that already exist. We need to build relationships. So I'm glad everyone talked about building relationships, because solidarity work is based on trust. And you cannot have trust if you don't have these deepened relationships. And that takes a lot of work and capacity. And then we also need to sharpen our analysis, yo. There's some great artists out there and I love them to death, but they need to sharpen their analysis. You know, my good friend, Dr. Emalani Case, who talked about intellectual work informs our activism, and intellectual is someone willing to represent a movement. So for me, that's why I constantly study. And it's not just reading books, which I do and important, but it's how we learn collectively from one another. To be honest, like when I first met Bambu, let me tell you, I met Bambu. I knew of Bambu because, you know, Isang Mahal brought me out. We went on a road trip together. They played a mixtape of Bambu. And I was like, oh, what? I got to meet him. That's what I did. I emailed Bam. And that's how me and him became friends and got connected. And when he came out to New York, we just chilled, you know? So, and I loved Bam. Movement organizing is about falling in love with your people. You know what I mean? And I fell in love with Bam. He's a great friend. I love his family. I love everybody in this movement. And how do we learn to love one another and build these relationships? You know, and now I can say, I know Bam for like 20 plus years. And Arnell too, you know what I'm saying? So like to
BFFs.
I thought that story was like someplace else. I wanted that.
Oh, we got stories we can't share on here,
yeah.
bro.
Well, you can bet. I seen his tweet. I was like, Bam, thanks for doing that. Text.
Important work.
Yeah. I think maybe let's have one more question before we kind of wrap up. But I think all three of you have been talking about this already. But what would we do to build solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement? What do we need to do? And even if I know where the idea behind this panel is to combat anti-Black racism, right? But also like in line with the things that you've all been saying in terms of the intersectional work that we need to do, so that keeping in mind also Indigenous folks, keeping in mind working class folks, immigrants, LGBTQI folks, right? How do we build solidarity first with the Black Lives Matter movement, but then how do we build solidarity in general? What would that look like? How would we go about operationalizing that?
I mean, I think there are many ways, obviously. I think that there's many books have been written about the many different ways in which we can show up and practice solidarity. Me personally, I think it happens collectively. So I don't think it's a matter of like, I myself am going to go out there and work in solidarity with Black liberation. I think find yourself an organization, find yourself folks that find a group of people that want to do this work and that do this work that maybe are more established, and continue with them. And that's how you build bridges and gaps. I mean, that's how you bridge gaps between communities, is building alliances, and those alliances collectively creating enough of a conflict to burst that bubble to create the social change that we need. But again, I think it doesn't happen alone. I think everybody that's listening here, go out, seek the local organizations in your community, find like-minded folks, and especially Filipino people. You know, if you're a young Filipino American and you want to find an organization that's working towards Black liberation, or at least solidarity with Black movements, then you should definitely go and seek that out. I think organizing, and like Kandi said, organizing is the way. The music I make is not music to just make you nod your head and enjoy it, but ultimately to get you to actually move I say it all the time. Like I'll take a comrade over a fan. Fans are great, but fans will move on to the next person. I think you need to apply the things that this conversation that we're having here on this panel. Take all this information and apply it. And again, organize. You know?
I'm gonna go next because I think Kandi would be the perfect one to tie it all up because she's amazing. I think everyone has to find their lane. You know what I mean? Because we have the organizers out there, we have the artists, we have. I think one thing we can all do is commit to the learning. So that's something that everyone can do. Everyone can commit to the learning, and then where you go beyond that, the next step is finding your lane of how you want to show your solidarity. That can be through your art, that can be through your writing, that can be through your donations, that can be through signing petitions, that can be showing up at, with organizations that are already organizing things out there at the protests. That can be prayer, that can be saying a prayer for someone, that can be holding space for someone that's struggling. But we're being called to do something. You just can't do nothing. You know what I mean? So I would just say, find your lane. I think we all have to commit to learning, and then finding your lane of what you're going to do with your words, your times, and your action.
Yeah, well, you all said some great things. And I don't feel like much to say except maybe just synthesizing it a bit. Like Bam talked a lot about, finding your organizations. That's about finding your political homes, really, like your political homes. Because you know why? Because we talked about transformative justice. And the only way you could do transformative justice is if people teach you how to be accountable. No one can hold you accountable. You got to learn how to be accountable. And the only way you can be accountable is if your organization, the folks around you, can guide you towards that and how you do your transformative justice work. And then on top of that, like, a lot of the things that Arnel was speaking about, pick your lane. It's also a disability justice practice. We talk a lot about, intersectionality, and in that a lot of times people with disabilities are excluded. And Arnel, every time you talk about your work, I tear up because it means a lot to me as a child, as I have 2 children with disabilities. And for me, disability justice practice, they have always taught us in the disability justice movement how everybody there's 101 ways to contribute to this movement. You know what I mean? And especially if you've got a platform like Bam does, like you do, Arnel, like, all the folks do, utilize your platform in this time. But it also can't just be performative, right? There is this, put your bodies on the line, but also we got to remember that different bodies, even us as people of color, as brown folks, our bodies are different in the way it is in when you show up to an action, different power, privilege again. So Adrienne Brown talks about small is all and small is good. And I think that's really important because I know that a lot of people want to contribute right now in this moment, but it's not always at an action. It's behind the scenes. Professor Wayne Yang talks a lot about deep organizing, and deep organizing is about like, who's going to look out for the folks who are putting out the trash? Who are the people in the everyday life who are making the flyers? Who's doing the event? Who's doing the organizing? Wherever is their labor and the unseen ways of organizing, it's behind the scenes a lot of times. It's not always at the action. And this is about long-term movement to get to freedom. And we're not going to get abolitionist waves of freedom overnight. So if you're either in this in the long haul, and if you're really in this in the long haul, then it's not just about showing up to one action in one day. This is about a long-term movement, and we need you here. And that's how I'm going to wrap that up for it.
Great. I wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. I want to especially thank...
wait, one more thing. Stop saying the N-word, Filipino people.
Yes, please.
We didn't mention that at all, but please stop using the N-word, especially young rappers out there. If you want to know why, holler at me at Bambu de Pistola. We can have a conversation. Sorry, Rod. I apologize. We just didn't mention it, and it was important.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. But thank you to Kandi. Thank you to Bam. Thank you to Arnel. And it's just kind of a way to wrap up. I just wanted to leave you all with just a couple questions. So first, from hearing everybody, I was thinking, what is the society that we all want to live in, right? What does that society look like? Who is part of that society? And is this society based in justice, in freedom, in peace, and in love? And lastly, what will you do to help create this society?